Welcome to the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. Before I announce today's speaker, let me preview what's going on for the rest of the quarter. We've got still quite a few talks left. So next week, the 17th is a holiday, that's President's Day. And then after that, we actually have 3 talks. So we have a talk every week until the end of the quarter because we moved one of the speakers up because of the fires. So on the February 24th, we have Mike Frank from Stanford University. His talk is called Bridging the Data Gap Between Children and AI Models. The week after that, we have Daniel Bowling, also from Stanford. His talk is Music and Health, Biological Foundations and Applications. And then the week after that, we have Tage Rye from UCSD. Some of you will know Tage because he got his PhD here at UCLA and was a regular attendee of BEC. So he'll be back. I don't have his title yet, but it is on punishment, evolutionary theories of punishment. And I think on the question of why punishment is not as effective as some models say it should be for changing people's behavior. So that's coming up. Those are the talks coming up. And then today is really my great pleasure to welcome Ryan Nichols, Professor Ryan Nichols from Cal State Fullerton Department of Philosophy, who is going to talk to us about lineage fitness, theory, and mechanisms. Please join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thanks for inviting me here. I wanted to begin with this question about what do you think you owe your ancestors and why? Why do you think you owe your ancestors what you think you owe them? And on what do those obligations depend? That's one of the origin points for this presentation of the theory in 4 or 5 years of development. And I'm inspired by this ancient Chinese thinker, Mengzi. He has this line in his book where, on the one hand, he has people who oppose his Confucian-centered ethics with a theory based on self-interest, very familiar, I think, to many people in the Western tradition, like Machiavelli. And Yang Zhu is this person's name. Behavior is focused on self-interest, so we need to allow people possibilities of maximizing that. On the other hand, Mencius was another person, Mozi, who has this concept, a universal love. So Mozi prefers the group as the major means of governing social behavior. Yang Zhu prefers the individual. And in between stood the hallmark of the Confucian tradition. And that's, you might answer this question differently or take a different perspective if you were from another culture. Or, for example, if you don't know who your ancestors are, maybe you have no clue who they are. How does that affect how you appraise your debt to them? Well, the goals of this paper are mainly to show you some elements of bridge building between, on the one hand, cultural evolutionary theory and on the other, evolutionary psychology. So currently, there's all kinds of reason to think that there's some significant problems with what ought to be good bridges between them. The Cultural Evolution Society members were surveyed a few years ago. They said that the biggest problem was knowledge synthesis facing that field, and the next biggest was theory. So in a review paper that I led with 10 other co-authors across 7 other disciplines, we came to a similar conclusion, in particular, that the explanatory ties between cultural evolution and biology were insufficiently articulated. And it goes from there. Web of Science studies suggest that since cultural evolution tends to be interested in understanding features of cooperation, and inclusive fitness theory is really about the only game in town, including, of course, reciprocal altruism, which I bank under the aegis of inclusive fitness theory, and yet in a survey of Web of Science publications, 18,000 some mention cultural evolution. 57 of those refer to inclusive fitness. It's kind of shocking. And last, if you're familiar with recent debates between the two camps, sometimes they've descended into what may not be any more scientifically productive discourse. On the evolution side, one of the biggest challenges for people who are on the cultural evolution side of the equation is that the most important people in the field have made blanket statements about the role of culture, or rather the lack of the role of culture in explanans and in explanations of human fitness-related behavior. So Buss, this quote is, biology is not in competition with culture for explanatory power. And the To Be in Cosmoses quote affirms that culture-like patterns of behavior can be explained without any appeal to social learning. So I imagine that for a lot of cultural evolutionary aficionados, this is like blood-boiling kind of language, whether or not it's accurate. And there's a slightly more sophisticated option presented in this Gangsted, Hazelton, and Buss paper. We can talk about that a little bit later. And I just wanted to mention, there's a more recent paper that attempts to diagnose this problem. Chen and colleagues, 2025, I guess, biology culture dualism. And it suggests that there's this pretty systematic problem in the way that people frame the scope of their explanans, the thing that's doing the explaining, in relation to the explananda, the thing to be explained. And this is a problem on both sides of the divide. So I wanted to try to build a bridge, and in part what I was attempting to do is honor cultural evolution's commitment that there are values, causal explanatory values, to appeal to groups. I shouldn't say not the, but appeal to groups. And second, I want to do that in a way that avoids the single most fractious debate, namely appeals to group selection from cultural evolution. Okay, so is that even possible? All right, so I was inspired, but with doing a reading with my friend Brian, we just finished this book up, and in the last chapter, Strelny has this wonderful quotation: cumulative cultural evolution is both an unusual and important feature of hominid evolution. To the extent that these information transmitting inheritance systems are distinctively hominid, their importance will not be captured by models built for other species. And this animates several points in what I'll present. So what is this lineage fitness theory? It has two parts. There's the hypothesis, which is before you, and a mechanism, which will be shortly. So according to this semi-formal statement, in a subset of human cultures, ancestors of lineages generated traditions and institutions that manipulated inputs to co-descendants' evolved psychological modules. In addition, those inputs altered I call them Hamiltonian interests. I mean, just the first-person fitness interest calculations on the part of their co-descendants. Consequentially, this influenced co-descendant behaviors in ways that marginally but systematically, as I'll try to show, increase the individual and inclusive fitness of ancestors. Right? The manipulation, I have a statement here, but let's skip that because I'll give you a better depiction of the mechanism. So this theory has quite a bit of debt to descendant-leaving theory in particular, especially to the work of Craig Palmer in this connection, who's served as a kind of mentor here and there for me, as has Bernie Crespi down here, one of the master theoretical biologists of our time, and his work in kin selection theories of religion, just incredibly fascinating, and sits right at this nexus between these two fields that I'm referring to. Less well known to me and less well known to anybody else is probably the work of Jürgen Jost. I say that, although he's the director of a Max Planck Institute, so he's no doubt very well known in his own respect. But a particular paper he wrote about selfish ancestor theory was directly inspiring to me, because it showed that there's significant scope in relation to the fitness concept that animates so much in the way of evolutionary biology. In particular, his expansion of this concept, as it's called, selfish ancestor theory is his term, feeds right into this role of the lineage, as I'll represent that. You know, my theory might be novel. I'm not really concerned about that right now. So, logic. First big section of this paper is to try to represent to you the logic of this theory, and this is an old school use of the word logic, whereby if a theory has a logic, then it can be inferred from first principles, and in turn, you can infer from it testable predictions. So this is related to inclusive fitness. So we start with inclusive fitness theory, and this formula is going to be very well known to many of you. This is just a calculation for the outcome of fitness sacrificing behavior, which Hamilton calls altruism. Relatedness, multiplied by the benefits minus the costs will predict conditions under which someone will perform fitness sacrificing behaviors. Very general, and it's such a theoretical virtue that it is so general. It applies to all kinds of species and all kinds of ecologies, at levels of scale, etc. And yet, I find it constrained in a couple of ways. In particular, it's not the best at accounting for features that cultural evolutionary people are so concerned with. Multi-generational effects, group level effects and interactions, it's challenged on these areas. So this is in fact why it's really deficits of inclusive fitness theory that led to models of cultural evolution in the first place. And as we'll see later, it leads to other models like commitment to war, the commitment to war model, if you know your Gintis and Bowles. So I throw up, so just like the previous presentation from 2020 that I was privileged to give to your audience, I have these call-outs in red just to illustrate ways in which I need to improve what I'm doing. So perhaps you have some insight you can suggest to me or some readings. Okay, so I want to give you a taste of the problem facing this theory. So inclusive fitness is constrained by extremely well-known factors that evolutionary psychologists and biologists have worked on for years on end. Kin detection and estimation in our species is pretty terrible. There are some papers by Porter that suggest that there are elements of olfaction that allow humans to succeed in some elements of kin detection, but for the most part, those are not so. Those are fragmentary, and instead, Lieberman, Tooby, Cosmides have adopted a different approach, suggesting that there are two main factors in our kin detection or kin estimation module, and these have to. Well, we'll come to those a little later. But if you can't recognize your kin, you're going to fail to maximize your inclusive fitness. I mean, to the extent that you fail to recognize your kin. So, sibling-sibling conflict, that's straightforward and pretty obvious. It's to parents' advantage to reduce sibling conflict and increase sibling cooperation. That is, it's to parents' fitness advantage to do so. And lastly, parent-offspring conflict. This is the key dimension here. These other two are important, but in some ways, number C stands out. So, and this is theoretically very well-known territory. Okay. So I note that in this paper by Trivers, he uses this concept of manipulation right here. By the way, may I also recommend Sperber and Atran, 91, fascinating about learning. So I embrace the ambiguity of this concept of manipulation. As it's used by somebody like Trivers and theoretical biologists, it is a little distinctive, but nice to see you again. We met in Fullerton one time, didn't we? No, I'm sorry. Probably. It's been it was for a conference put on. Never mind. Anyway, nice to see you. Sorry. Pardon viewers at home. So manipulation, on the one hand, can be performed without some kind of self-awareness. On the other hand, it can be extremely self-aware and planned, even planned generations in advance. And that's something that, rather than being a defect, is a feature of what I propose. So these are the two that I attempt to manipulate on a daily basis. And it comes with benefits and significant costs, among things, to my mental health, not to mention my bank account, but we're working on it. What I wanted to point out is that when I'm manipulating my kids, and maybe when you are manipulating yours, it's quite narrow to conceive of this as parent-offspring conflict, as the quote from Trivers was doing. I say that in part because almost every tool in my manipulative tool bag as a parent, I have inherited from other people. Sometimes I inherit them from horizontal transmission elsewhere in culture. Oftentimes I've inherited them from my ancestors. That itself just is a foot in the door, as it were, to rethinking the nature of manipulation. So everything I mentioned about A, B, and C earlier is a consequence. So all of this mutatis mutandis can be reapplied to ancestor-descendant conflict. Granted, there's a problem we'll come to a little bit later, namely the diminishing genetic relatedness between ancestors and descendants. I have not forgotten about that, of course, but that's a bit later. But this manipulation, notice it can be done post-mortem. And people can be quite confused about this, but it's not as though somebody's literally acting from the dead, although, interestingly, for most of human history, we have believed they did exactly that. Okay, the nature of religion and supernatural punishment is quite important in this context. But no, I'm talking about incentivizing people's behavior by planning things prior to your death through, say, bequests and wills. Those are the most familiar tools we have now to manipulate our ancestors. So this leads us to a different perspective. So the dominant objection to what I'll present to you has to do with the nature of costs. So we will also come to that. Now, for a semi-formal presentation of the model, really this is, I'm going to skip the definitions. I have these here as means of returning to slides that are not hidden and difficult to get back to. But the only thing I wanted to point out, nothing controversial in my definitions, but I wanted to lay them out in early modern philosophy fashion. So the one thing I do want to point out is that the concept of fitness underlying here, drawn from both Jost and Dawkins, might stand out as a little unusual. The reason is that most of evolutionary biology, most of experimental biology is looking at very, very short-term fitness-related benefits. We're talking Drosophila or species on which you can experiment multiple generations in the course of a year. So Dawkins has this throwaway line, the relative number of descendants alive after some very large number of generations. There's plenty of vagueness in this, but at heart, it's quite a powerful concept. And from the perspective of a lineage, this is the kind of thing that is most suitable as a unit of fitness to application to a multi-generational species like ours, or so I will now argue. So the consequence is I propose adding a manipulation factor to Hamilton's formula. So we have manipulation, which is obviously being in relationship here to genetic relatedness and benefits, and we have to subtract costs, and we're going to output fitness sacrificing behavior. So I'm not going to worry too much about the valence of these or even how they are formalized, the variables are formalized. I just want to make a theoretical case here, but sometimes this can be quite helpful to see it represented. So here, I argue that these are some significant advantages of including manipulation in this ambiguous, non-offensive sense into our better understanding of human uniqueness, I guess, human uniqueness and fitness sacrificing behavior within us. Okay, so of course, if you're adding a term, you need to define that term, and I do so here. Again, I probably won't get into the details because I want to make the most of this opportunity to get your feedback, and this would be a little long-winded. Suffice it to say that we have an efficiency measurement. So there are manipulative traditions, but some are better at they're achieving their aims than others. Resistance, of course, as Trivers predicts, kids will want to resist your parental manipulation, and so indeed they do. So that's represented as its own variable. Institutions play a unique role. I mean, the lineage manipulation mechanism I will detail in just a moment is focused on traditions, but institutions stand at the edge, prepared to enforce behavior compliant with the traditions. A baby lineage of 10 generations might have great traditions, but they've lacked investment in their institutions. So M may reduce as a result. And here, G sub C, influence of traditions on allele frequencies. And this to me, this is important because so much cultural evolution has gone far away from old school gene culture coevolution that we don't think about the genetic component here. Both how traditions manipulate allele frequencies and how they themselves are manipulated by allele frequencies. I have some examples later. Okay, so how do these manipulative traditions work to modify a couple of these variables? Well, so to the extent that a tradition is going to raise the efficiency of its manipulative ability on co-descendants, it's likely to be targeted to evolved cognitive modules. Because if it's not, if it's targeted elsewhere or it's targeted to multiple modules, et cetera, it's going to more or less be inefficient at moving behavior forward in ways that marginally increase ancestor or lineage elder fitness. So here, related, you want to use manipulations that end up changing people's emotions in a way that you would like. Related, the more early you can encode a tradition, this might have to do with extensions of the human life history, and those are interestingly different across cultures. That's also part of this. So examples of manipulating G. So reproductive traditions. We'll talk quite a bit about reproductive traditions. Genetic selection, there are a number of allelic polymorphisms, only some of which, for any given gene locus, are advantageous to elders and ancestors. Others are not. So the DRD4 7R plus repeats are rather hazardous to ancestors. These, like, if you have the 7R or more repeats, you have too much dopamine for ancestors, likely to me, too much dopamine for ancestors to effectively manage. See a Chen paper from 1999, back when human behavior and evolution had a different name. Fascinating paper about that particular kind of issue. And there's herding traditions. This is the kind of old standard from cultural evolution. While it does, so herding traditions appear to have selected for LCT. I probably am telling no one new information here. But on the other hand, yeah.
I have a question of information.
Sure.
As a developmental psychologist, how are you using manipulation to mean socialization and teaching? Is it covering all of those things? Because manipulation in developmental psychology usually is, something negative and very narrow.
Yeah.
Like socialization and parental or intergenerational teaching, I have kind of a feeling you're using it to cover all those.
I am, exactly. Yeah, I don't mean to. It's not. Don't associate my term with puppet strings and the ancestors or our elders pulling us around like that. It's not that ominous. So yes, teaching. So the Sperber and Tran paper, they discuss this latter way of manipulation that you refer to, using learning traditions. So even Trivers says that parents are very likely to oversell their ability, the importance of their knowledge to their kids in an effort to blend in indoctrination with information to better manipulate them. So so I intend this to be a value neutral term at this point.
Yeah, well, for us in developmental psychology, it's not value neutral, but it seems now you're maybe using it to just mean influence.
No, it's a little bit different, because here the manipulation is directed at improving ancestors' marginal fitness. So influence might not be, but this is from an evolutionary perspective, this is goal directed. But hopefully I can make a few more other things clear as we go. Okay, so the mechanism. So here, this is a famous painting on the riverbank during the Qingming holiday, painted in like 1082 by a famous Chinese artist Zhang. So this represents the sweep of ancestor traditions in life, and I think Stedman, Palmer, Tilley, and Crespi and Summers both capture some of this element in the descendant leaving theory and kin selection theories of religion. So ancestor religion functions in this theory I'm attempting to introduce as the primary gear of moving manipulation across generations. And the reason is that it's much like a Swiss Army knife of manipulation. It covers all kinds of bases: emotions, deferential emotions to elders, worship, religion. It covers philosophical concepts like our moral duties, etc. So at least in the Chinese culture, ancestor religion is at the heart of much of what was happening. And that's true according to these authors and others, ancestor religion is far and away the most ubiquitous human religion in early societies. Maybe even still today, if you count up all the cultures around. So what is this mechanism? Well, so we can talk about some of the details. I'll skip this. This is one of those slides stuck in here in case you would rather return to this during Q&A. But this is the overall mechanism. Okay, so this is intended. This is intended as a representation of how ancestors will operationalize their fitness interest through culture, through cumulative culture. So here are evolved cognitive modules. These are stimuli that enter into these modules, okay? And some subset of those are manipulated by our lineage. There are many other sorts of things that are also getting in there. I'm not concerned with those right now. So we have these computations, these modules: paternal uncertainty estimator, paternal investment heuristic, kinship estimator, welfare trade-off ratio. So receiving some inputs, these computational algorithms working in the background of our brain, if you'll pardon me for using that kind of language, output a bunch of other stuff. Emotions, cognitions, and attitudinal values, which might not be reducible to either of those first two categories. These are represented here. So emotions, shame at norm violations that my ancestors have told me I should be ashamed of. Cognition, so we have a lot, maybe long-term orientations that ancestors prefer I have than short-term orientations. Norm following, represented down here in attitudinal values, maybe obedience, maybe the importance of extended kin that I might not see every day. So these proximate effects of the modules are eventually leading to behavior, and that can take, as far as this mechanism is concerned, that takes two major shapes. One, behaviors that decrease ancestors' marginal fitness, and behaviors that increase ancestors' marginal fitness. And these behaviors don't have a subsequent further adjustment. They move into what I just call final behaviors here. And these have to get routed through some institutions. So I rely on some examples from Chinese culture, but I don't need to. It's just most familiar to me. So among things, there were, in the very early, in the Qin dynasty, the first Chinese dynasty that we tend to think about, there were laws that allowed lineage elders to engage in capital punishment of their co-descendants. And indeed, there are great cases recorded in Qin law where that happens. So lineage elder, so you have, maybe influence or manipulation fail, produces behaviors that decrease ancestor fitness, and that gets routed through an institution. Now, when those behaviors are sufficiently scandalous to put at risk significant ancestor fitness, so for example, behaviors that were even thought to be treasonous, they might be subject to, in Chinese it's called the 9 familial exterminations, where your lineage would be executed by the state for a misbehavior of one single person in the lineage. Right? Those behaviors must be dealt with by an institution because they put at risk the entire body of fitness of an ancestor or of a lineage elder. And indeed, in Qin law, people were allowed to put to death some of their co-descendants. Finally, we have these final behaviors, and this iterates over here to the next generation, and it keeps cycling through. And there's elements of feedback. Okay, people will be improving their effectiveness of these traditions. So there may be things missing. Happy to hear from you about what's missing or what just doesn't make sense. I had enlarged versions because I wasn't sure how easy this would be to see, but I think you were able to see that. Now, we enter 3 areas, 3 applications of the mechanism. Right? The first one is survival and death, which I guess an emphasis on death. But before each of these 3, I wanted to highlight a feature of, so most of the time I'm being engaged with evolutionary an evolutionary sciences audience rather than a cultural evolution. There are strategic reasons for that. They're a little harder to convince sometimes, and they have, honestly, higher standards, higher methodology. But we have these passages from Sober and Wilson, which I'll pair with some others. Group selection favors any behavior that increases the relative fitness of groups. Full stop. Merely by proper application of rewards and punishments, virtually any high-cost group beneficial behavior can be promoted. Now, I don't want to say, far be it from me to accuse these brilliant people of falsehood exactly, but this is misguided. And the emphasis on possibilities here doesn't serve the scientific process very well. That might be true. So with survival, riddle me this. Can you imagine a extremely high-cost behavior? Say lineage elders decide to put to death about 1 of every 4 offspring that are produced, not in conditions of scarcity. Can you imagine a situation where any behavior, a behavior where lineage elders kill maybe 1/4 of their offspring, and they do it for generations and generations? How does that benefit the group? Well, this inclusive fitness theory has a big problem, and maybe it's theoretically possible here. Hold that thought. So most of the stuff about survival that I've read, this is not pinpoint on lineage fitness theory. This is because these sorts of traditions are predicted by inclusive fitness theory. What elder would not want to teach their kids to recognize poisonous plants from nutritious plants, right? My theory is not making a unique prediction. Skip that. there are possible unique predictions about survival, but it might be that survival is kind of a weaker domain for my theory to be applied to. I'm interested if you have some suggestions. I found this quite interesting, though. There's some pockets of cultural anthropology literature that do speak to lineage-relevant traits or traditions. So one is sequestration of medical knowledge and ethnobotanical knowledge. That's quite interesting. You might want, if you're a lineage person and you're in interlineage competition, you may well have a reason to protect that information. It could be valuable to our enemies. I'm more interested in killing of co-descendants. Okay. So when is this killing predicted by inclusive fitness theory? If you have a multi-generational lineage and about 1 out of every 4 offspring of co-descendants is put to death systematically, and furthermore, it's not related to scarcity. That inclusive fitness theory predicts, right? If it's scarcity, and I can only, this is like Sophie's choice, if I can only have 1 kid and I can't feed 2, then okay, maybe I need to kill 1, God forbid. But even outside scarcity, there are lineages that killed about 1 every 4 children. So inclusive fitness theory would suggest that this would be marked by extremely violent secession of these people. Like a mother and father, perhaps married people, have a kid, maybe the only kid they're ever able to have, and their lineage elder tells them, you have to kill that. You have to kill that baby. So inclusive fitness theory has a great challenge in predicting this. And why do people do it? If not willingly, willingly, they don't revolt, okay? So why would doing so raise marginal fitness gains of lineage elders? So here, it's practiced without scarcity. It's practiced primarily on females. This is the tradition of female infanticide. And indeed, it is a tradition systematically passed from one generation to the next. And it's a tradition almost exclusively practiced among patrilineages. 1 out of 4 kids for some long periods of Chinese history. Within certain lineages across periods of Chinese history. Part 2, okay, this is the second application, mutualism. Okay, so I mentioned these constraints earlier. So the question is, how could lineage elders develop cultural traditions that solve these problems, thereby increasing their marginal fitness over that of competitors? And furthermore, it's even worse when you add generations. That's why we have a formula representing m to the n power. The number of generations will end up constraining manipulation efforts. So here, there's all kinds of reason to think that people will cooperate with other people when Hamilton's formula tells them that's to their benefit. But what we see is that in anthropological sources, I've just been reading the Noble Savages. In fact, I brought it with me. So what happens for Chagnon and the folks he's working with is that cooperation in highly lethal raids is far above a Hamilton's formula threshold. So you might remember this from a much older paper. 30% of adult males among the Yanomamo people are killed through violence, due principally to interlineage warfare. In fact, he says that interlineage warfare is the ultimate socio-organizing principle in the folks he's studying. Not only that, but many other stellar anthropologists have documented the ways that lineage is a preeminent social functional category at the basis of traditional life. Okay, so my thought here is that on the one hand, standard evolutionary thinking has great challenges explaining this. So I mentioned bounded rationality. So this is where some of this goes. The commitment to war model, for example, is one based on bounded rationality. And the idea here is that, well, these Yanomami people, these males, they've been deceived by rituals, or they have some problems doing some time inconsistent, time discounting about future preferences. They're swept into things. They're just irrational, etc. And so notice, strategically speaking, at the bigger level of argument here, bounded rationality sweeps in precisely when inclusive fitness formulas don't explain behavior. And in this case, I find it's a stretch for me. Okay, if you read the Chagnon and his detailed reports of what's happening amongst his research subjects there, it's not as though these people, the third cousin from the Beano Terry or something, it's not as though that person is ignorant about what happened to his brother or to his first cousin last time his great-great uncle called everybody to a raid. They died. So the bounded rationality explanation, when fitness costs, mortality risk is so high, it stretches some credibility to me. But moreover, bounded rationality is often functioning via ancestor traditions. So in the book, Bowles and Gintis mentioned things like feasting and raiding, parties and rituals and so on. This is played out in Chagnon's books on a regular basis. So it's not as though bounded rationality is independent of lineage manipulation. So here we see, this is from a different source now, not Sober and Wilson, but the importance of group selection. If cultural rules arise that cause individuals to sacrifice their own interests for the good of the group, cultural selection can cause the frequency of individually costly but group beneficial traits to increase. Maybe, for example, the trait of allowing somebody else to throw you into a failed raid and kill you. Right? Again, this is where the methodological individualism of the standard boilerplate evolutionary psychologist makes a lot of sense to me. This seems challenged. So in the context of explaining why distant kin would engage in raids that are highly likely to be lethal after they've done a few, both sides seem to be a bit wrong-headed. I don't think they're quite capturing the what needs to be explained. All right. So some of this has to do with the multi-generational feature of what we're talking about. And the role of kinship manipulation is part of this. Second, I find that the cultural evolution folks tend to shift from individual to group, much like you could think of a weird society doing. Like think of bowling alone. We lost our groups. Somehow we often lost those. Instead, we have individual life and group life, social media or whatever. That's a remarkably fast shift. Whereas for tens of thousands of years, the lineage seemed to be the predominating social functional category. Anyway, then we'll just set aside issues about group selection, but that's a bugaboo for many, many people. How does a manipulation mechanism solve kinship detection and estimation, sibling rivalry, and parent-offspring conflict? There are many traditions that are focalized on just those kinds of problems. And remember, if ancestors can solve these problems, they are raising their marginal fitness against competitors. So co-rearing and co-nursing, I mentioned this earlier, but I mean, so there are many ways that this can happen. Cross-marriage, various types of marriage we'll get into can help. Having traditional forms of architecture where you have many different lineage members of different R-relatedness living under the same roof or in the same compound. So you're raised with your first cousins and second cousins. And when you think about that, it can blur this line. If I am raised with people, suppose that I'm raised with somebody who I'm not even kin related to, but I'm raised with that person, and people use language to inform me that that is my brother, and he calls me brother, and our parents call us sons, etc. This will end up changing your kinship estimation in ways that favor ancestors' marginal fitness. Related, I wanted to clarify something here. I'm kind of still working this part out, but there's mutualism and there's post-manipulation mutualism. And I think drawing a distinction between the two and mathematizing the post-manipulation effects on fitness sacrificing behavior can be kind of helpful for this model. So the goal of manipulation is just to increase more or less the compliance of individuals with traditions. The ultimate effect, though, is to raise post-manipulation mutualism. So I try to develop a formula that accounts for this and that can be plugged into the overall model. But I'm happy to skip that. I have a little example here about how it plays out when when a mother is half successful at manipulation. And no one's proposing that people are raising the level of M to 1. It's usually, maybe half. We can raise it from 0.5 to, so 0.5 is kind of the baseline of manipulation based on genetic relatedness. That's just kind of an assumption that I'm making. And then to the extent you can bounce a R of 0.5, namely your kid, up to 0.75. You go from your base rate mutualism to 0.75. You've raised it significantly via manipulation. That's what we see. That's what I lay out here at the bottom. I'm talking so fast. I hope that's okay. I just wanted to really hear from you more than listen to myself talk. But this is represented graphically in a nice tree. I've modified this quite a bit, but this is from Coe, Palmer, and DeVito, and I kind of combined their things into one and made a couple alterations. But I just wanted to point out with maybe it's modest, but sort of half successful manipulative tradition about kinship. Can raise mutualism. It can solve sibling rivalry, parent-offspring conflict, and kinship estimation detection. And it's kind of interesting. So these two, so in their way of doing it, N and O are third cousins. So they have an R relatedness that is exceedingly low. I mean, it's infinitesimal, and yet by manipulation, they can conceive of themselves as, now, sorry, I'm using welfare trade-off ratio, excuse me. I should have revised that because we're not so focused on it. This is Sell, Tooby, Cosmides, and some other authors several years ago crafted welfare trade-off ratio as a computational model whereby that is sort of output as a better understanding of what I can get back from my behavior from somebody else. Anyway, so modest manipulation raises a very, very low R relatedness up very significantly. I did it a bit differently here, but just for like fourth cousins, you can. So this is kind of remarkable because genetic relatedness 0.007 among third or 0.078. You potentially can raise this even factoring for a diminishing success rate of manipulation across generations, which is not necessary, but it's a charitable. It makes it more challenging for my model. You can still achieve a fairly robust form of manipulation out of this. Okay, so my case, I guess, is that standard theories in evolutionary psychology and social sciences underestimate the role of post-manipulation mutualism, the bump you get from manipulating kin. So this might be very helpful for understanding why people would choose to engage in activities that are almost certain after a few years to lead to their death. Second, this the claim is that the lineage manipulation mechanism can generate higher post-manipulation mutualism, and it works in contexts that seem to go against individual co-descendant fitness. This is an important point because it's important to make this point only so that you understand how this theory is intended to differ from standard inclusive fitness theories. And I'm still going to insist lineage fitness here is not a case of group selection. The group in the cultural evolution world that I read about, groups are populations of unrelated individuals, and this is very importantly different from that. Okay, so now mating and marriage. This is the third. Application. So sexual strategies theory may be quite familiar to you. So all other things being equal, males have a higher ceiling of reproductive success than females. So as a consequence, we will take this on. So let me scoot over. So okay, constraints. So just like with kin selection, so there are constraints on ancestors' ability to solve marriage problems to increase their marginal fitness. And here we have a situation where paternal uncertainty is the big problem. Cuckoldry, paternal investment, challenges of mate guarding, and so forth. These are all problems that constrain lineage success. So how, and of course these get worse for ancestors. So the greater the number of generations, the more genetic distance, and the less effective might be manipulation techniques. So here again, Boyd and Richardson, yet again, the same kind of claim. This is the stuff. This is like fingernails on chalkboard to certain people on the evolutionary camp, and I completely understand why. So you're probably sick of hearing me talk. I just wanted to pause for 60 seconds and ask you to think like an ancestor for just a second. So could we go for? I'll put on a timer, but could you just chat with your neighbor briefly? What traditions do you think ancestors could generate in a manipulation mechanism kind of context that would overcome these constraints? Paternal certainty, mate guarding, and paternal investment. Sorry, paternal patrilineal investment. Could you just pause to chat with your neighbor about what traditions can solve this problem, if any? And I'll take a drink. Thank you.
Taking the father's last name. That's right.
So did anybody think of some ideas they want to share? I don't mean to make this teachy, to the contrary. I just thought you might want to chat for a second. Well, of course, I've thought of some ideas myself. They're represented in this figure. So it's kind of, so I will zoom in to make it much more understandable, okay? I'm focused a bit on patrilineal lineages in this section here. Patrilocality is one thing that can assist in managing some of these traditions. If a woman is surrounded by people on the same patriline, and she's not related to that patriline, then that reduces non-lineage cuckoldry by itself. Polygyny, of course, we talked about this previous slide. Mate guarding, if you can systematize or institutionalize mate guarding with traditions, then that will also increase paternal certainty, and that's just extremely important. For the sake of patrilineal lineages, it's very important because it's paternal certainty and effective mate guarding tradition that finally unlock patrilineal investment. Otherwise, that can be greatly constrained. And finally, after that, we might want to, thinking like an ancestor here, you might want to do certain things, create certain traditions that raise male biased sex ratio. And that's represented here. So in particular, the case of female infanticide is represented. And that raises numbers on the patriline. That has lots of beneficial consequences. It has terrible consequences, but from the perspective of certain persons in the lineage, that can be helpful. So here, marriage and mating serve as these lineage-based reproductive strategies. And throughout the world, in all kinds of small-scale societies, arranged marriage is extremely common. And in these cases, ancestors align their own interests with marriage traditions. And this is true of general, like polygyny, monogamy, that kind of thing, but also true of very particular marriage systems that I hope to mention very briefly in passing. Mate preferences, so mate preference modules, mate strategies, these are all features that have been conditioned by ancestors or the traditions from the lineage. Moral norms, like in Chinese, zhenjie, things like that, these become their own, chastity becomes its own tradition. Mate guarding sex ratio, honor culture in the Indian subcontinent, lamentably common. So this also functions in a certain way for the elders. But of course, the descendant whose daughter is committing some infraction that leads her brothers or her uncle perhaps to murder her, the inclusive fitness of those individuals are lowered by this event. And bride price, this is fascinating. If you don't know the work of Valerie Hudson, you could check out that paper. She has a lot to say about bride price and its manipulation in quote unquote open markets as a means of serving lineage elders' interests. Okay, so progress report from I gave a presentation in 2020, and I just wanted to mention as far as mate guarding and foot binding is one means of mate guarding, and in this publication, I and my colleague Laura Smith Chowdhury and my other friend Ela Zhang, we created an agent-based model to try to see whether there's an evolutionary function there or whether the dominant theory, the labor market theory, was right. And our modeling at least suggests using actual demographic data from about 700 years of Chinese history, it suggests that the evolutionary sciences hypothesis is on the right track. And further, a subsequent paper. So I thank you or your ancestors for all your comments that helped us with that. Literally, I do that right here. Okay. So briefly, this is a pretty brief aside. In fact, I'm going to make it even more brief because I see we're running out of time. So there are lots of ways that. Do you want to? Evolutionary psychology would suggest that it's almost never in an individual's interest to defer reproduction to invest in distant descendants. It just doesn't make sense from the perspective of lineage elders. But there are ways in which it does, and the most obvious is derivative of the grandmother hypothesis. Now, when it comes to another objection, I'm not very sure about this, as you can see here, but I have a kind of a betting the farm response to this criticism, whereby it could be that this like octogenarian lineage elder has all of his inclusive fitness that will ever be in the entire world is right below him in these lines of descent. So for this person, it might be just, what else am I going to do? You know, I need to just put all my money into investment for those folks. The third one, though, is what I wanted to get to, and I think I'm going to have to skip over this because despite my fast talking, I'll be a little low on time. I just wanted to point out that lots of cultures have solved this problem, and remarkably, this type of solution is at the very beginning of Chinese culture. In the Shang Dynasty, okay, like 1400 plus BCE, they had a very unusual marriage system that it took years and years for Casey Chang to finally work out. Anyway, these types of particular marriage systems ramp up genetic relatedness among co-descendants. So it responds to this objection, oh, there's a diminishing genetic return. So you can use these formulas and knowledge about particulars to cash this out. Just get to the chase. So for the cross-cousin marriage, I think this is the one that Chagnon talks about. So in an individualist model, you know, the n equals 5 is extremely low. Like 5 generations down after random mating of my descendants to other people, I'm not very genetically related to those folks. But in the cross-cousin marital system, it's so n plus 5 generations away, that ancestor has a genetic relatedness of 0.17. Remarkable, okay? And this is between a half-sibling and a first cousin. All right, so costs. Lots of costs. Reproductive is one we just mentioned, and that's what I'll continue to focus on. That seems to be the highest cost. Costs differ between generation, maintenance, and enforcement. Generation of a tradition is very costly. Enforcement maybe less so. Maintenance, it's not that costly at all. The types of cost are here among others, and this is where I could use possible help. I don't know if I've really captured this objection with its full grip. All of these lower the prior probability of my theory. So, female elders, we mentioned, there's a carve out for that, right? If postmenopausal female elders are not investing in their lineage and are engaging in further reproductive activities when they're not fertile anymore, that's not going to benefit their bottom line. So we would expect this to apply. And notice, I want to insist on this point. It's not matrilineal societies that are doing this. Women who are postmenopausal in patrilineal societies are going to be subject to the same kinds of constraints. And they might turn their focus more towards the future than would men in their same position. Very important to me. What about men? My sense is that this might be a kind of a bias, but I think people really play down the precipitous drop in male reproductive potential over the lifespan. So this, to some extent, this I imagine still applies for men. And by the way, in my opinion, lineage fitness theory is going to suggest that maybe older males rather than younger males are more likely to invest in their future descendants, right, for reasons having to do with reproductive costs. The theory is conditional. There's some other problems that might be more of a philosophy of science kind of thing. How about I just spare you some of this, and I'll get to the last couple of slides. So this is this in the conclusion, I promise. So this theory makes falsifiable predictions. This table is intended to respond to the objection that what's new about this theory? Nothing. And it's also intended to reply to the objection that this theory isn't making genuine testable hypotheses. Here are a few. Distant kinship estimation. So in cultures with lineage manipulation mechanisms as opposed to cultures without them, or sorry, more robust mechanisms, less robust, we are likely to see a difference in which lineage members overestimate their genetic relatedness. And that's not seen in the comparison class. Consolidation on sex, this is really the most important one, right? This is the one that ancestors would, their evolutionary computational mind would care most about. Did I leave a lot of descendants? So the idea here is that in cultures with LMMs, or lineages with these manipulation mechanisms, the more robust the mechanism, the more descendants these folks will have left. Likewise, for some other ones, H3, I'll come to that. That's really kind of bread and butter evolutionary psychology. The grandmother, patrilineal versus matrilineal, grandparental investment, the dozens of studies about this. And what I'm saying is, you know what? There might be more to it than that, and so on, okay? So to the conclusion, back to our opening theme in a certain way. So this hypothesis 3 about patrilineal, grandparental, matrilineal, grandparental investment. H3 says ancestors allocate resources to distant co-descendants, prioritizing lineage level fitness over individual co-descendants and their fitness. This can take different forms we're not caring about. But as I mentioned, this seems to be opposed to basic results in sexual strategies theory. And it turns out that the unanimity of that literature is not nearly as robust once you start digging into it. There's a huge spat about using direct or indirect measures of grandparental investment. That's a methodological problem. But even when those are controlled for by studies using direct measures, like how much money did you give, how much time did you babysit, et cetera, how much time did you teach, using direct measures, we still see cross-cultural differences that go against this hypothesis. So Kaptigian, he found that in China, his Chinese subjects, he disconfirms this basically its derivative of paternal certainty. He disconfirms the paternal certainty hypothesis, showing that the patrilineal grandparents invested significantly more than matrilineal. That was just the opposite with the Dutch. So, and we put it another way, go figure, when people tested weird cultures, they were conforming to the norm, and in this case, the Chinese sample did not. And that's true not just in China, it's true there in China too, but Pashos discovers the same flip in Greece, as Greece participants. Okay, so that might be partial evidence. I'm not so concerned about posterior probability right now. I'm really introducing the theory to you. However, I want to conclude with the following couple of comments. Kaptigian makes this discovery, and this is his interpretation. A grandparental investment bias towards sons' children was found, which goes against the paternity uncertainty hypothesis. These results raise doubts over the relevance of paternity uncertainty as an explanation of grandparental investment bias towards daughters' children. That's right out there. Right? He's kind of found this result, makes this claim, fine. Then he says, he's basically proposing he falsified this very noble, long lineage kind of theoretical posit in evolutionary psych. Then he interprets. Citing Boyd and Richardson, cultural evolutionary heroes, the results suggest that discriminative grandparental investments are better understood as the outcome of cultural prescriptions of reciprocity than by the paternal uncertainty hypothesis. So, evolutionary psychology prediction, falsified, pivots over to cultural evolution. And the problem that I feel like this is perpetuating a certain kind of false dilemma. It's using cultural evolution as a god of the gaps, if you're familiar with that classic fallacy from critical thinking 101. So here we're left with the people who advocate a very more narrow, individualist, self-interested kind of perspective on human behavior. The Yang Jews, the standard evolutionary psychology. Cumulative culture has no explanatory or causal role, and traditions are explicable through cultural. Cultural evolution, this is a little messed up, sorry. Cultural evolution, on the other hand, tries to go from the individual self-interest person all the way to the level of the group. But what we're missing is this important something in between, and that is lineage fitness. So here, the theory is intended to recognize the role of the lineage as a unit of social organization and as a tool of ancestors. Okay. Sorry, that last slide was a little messed up. Thank you for so much of your time. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. We have about half an hour for questions.
I'll try one.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. The lineage fitness approach is interesting. I don't really know much about that. So, one thing I was wondering is, I'm looking for the cultural evolutionary dynamics because it seems like most of this is an ebb-psych kind of perspective, and the lineage groups are kin groups. So I'm trying to figure out. You had this early figure that was sort of it was a crazy John Tooby looking thing with all the inputs and outputs.
Yeah, okay.
And
I'll circle back.
I was trying to figure out where the cultural evolutionary dynamics were in that.
Okay.
And so then trying to just point out more clearly. I mean, I think I can answer part of this myself if I tried, but I just would like you to maybe address more directly where the distinctive cultural evolutionary phenomena exist in the whole thing, because it seems pretty upside.
Understood. Yeah, that completely makes sense to me. In part because I'm trying to reach the ev-psych style audience, so that kind of affected the way it was presented. So I mentioned, it's funny because the way I originally conceived this project was to combine cultural evolution part and the ev-psych part, but that didn't work because it ended up, I mixed evidence with theory in a way that displeased audience members. So this is the diagram you're mentioning. So the core part of cultural evolutionary, like the cultural evolutionary factors, are really represented, I guess, over here insofar as the lineage. So this little box over here. So the lineage, by hypothesis, the lineage is crafting, say, ancestor religion. That's the major gear here. So if you step back and look at ancestor religion, there are lots of religions out there, and all of them are different. But it turns out that ancestor religion is able to give ancestors these marginal fitness gains like nothing else. Why? Well, so this calls for a study of mechanisms within ancestor religion. How did that work? How did people exploit specific rituals to worship one common ancestor that involved many people, not only from the trunk lineage, but from the branch lineage, for example? So that's inching into the cultural evolutionary feature. And then the other way that cultural evolution and kind of anthropology, generally speaking, works is by contributing to understanding institutions. So the institutions are these enforcement mechanisms that are running parallel to cultural traditions, and they are subject to lots of exploitation by elders. And elders typically use them to try to enforce their will on people who don't abide by the tradition. But the other way to take your question is where's the group selection here? And it's in that respect that there's no cultural evolution here, because I'm trying to explain lots of cultural forms. And indeed, in some ways, I want to be, if a bolder person would say it's kinship and the lineage that explains the evolution of cumulative culture. I don't go that far, but that gives you, that's a bite at your question.
Sure, yeah. I guess it follows the ev-psych perspective that the cultural evolutionary dynamics are approximate.
Yeah, for the most part, this... Right, so, okay. The type of culture that I was focusing on, we were having a conversation earlier about this. So cultural evolution is so omnivorous that you can read papers about, there's an interesting paper about the cultural selection for portrait painting in Europe. Great. That's not necessarily having anything to do with fitness. There's another part of culture that does have to do with fitness, and unfortunately or not, cultural evolution kind of grabs all of that and puts them in the same system. Whereas I'd like to think that when culture is quite fitness relevant, we ought to pay close attention to what our evolutionary theorists are telling us.
So kind of continuing on that vein, my internal Rob Boyd is speaking right now, saying that you might need a cultural evolution component in the standard kind of Boyd and Richardson sense to think about why some lineage manipulation mechanisms would succeed better than others, right?
and or the origin of them. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, like if there's actual, rationality or intentionality in the invention of these traditions, that would be an interesting thing if the ancestors were actually thinking, well, if we put this rule in place, there'll be more of us in the future. Possible, right? But the classic sort of Boyd Richardson thing would be there's just variation in traditions, and then some of them succeed more than others, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem inconsistent with your story, because I get the idea that this is a special class of traditions that influence family perpetuation right through the future. But I guess my question part is, who benefits from these? I mean, you framed it as the ancestors benefit, but it seems like in the Chinese case and these other cases that you might be thinking about, it's actually a class or group. It's everyone who endorses these mechanisms or that makes these their traditions that would benefit, right? So in that sense, the target of selection could be genetically unrelated groups.
Let's see.
Every patrilineage or whatever adopts certain kinds of rules in a particular geographic area, then they might not be related, but there's a group selection, cultural group selection component that they all.
Yes. Okay. Right.
I think I see where you're going. Yeah.
That would be I would think, a reply that someone might give coming from this cultural evolution tradition.
Right. Yeah. So.
So you hit on something about competition between groups, and this is near and dear to this theory. So it turns out that numerous studies like anthropological studies among roughly contemporary populations, genetic studies of the mid-Neolithic, and everything in between have emphasized the role of group competition. But I still get uncomfortable talking about group competition where group is a bunch of unrelated people, because it seems to me that that's just not the way human history has worked for the last, X number of millennia. And so I think I see what you mean. Like your inner Rob Boyd might say, well, but there's intergroup competition here. And I would say, well, under one situation there is. It's just that by group, we're talking about lineages. Lineages, so among the Yanomamo people, right, that's lineages competing against other lineages, often in lethal warfare. And there's Jung, Feldman, and a couple other authors have a model of Neolithic genetic data suggesting that in the Neolithic, it was lineages competing against other lineages. So the idea of a cultural evolutionary group with unrelated people, that is, I don't know, that seems quite unrealistic,
Right. No, I get it. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, it seems to me that there could be a case where, let's call it the group of traditions that you're talking about, like a particular set of LMMs, right? Yeah. The group of people that end up having those LMMs are not all in a single lineage. There's multiple lineages that share those LMMs.
Yes, right. Okay.
And so that seems to be, you need a group selection dynamic, the cultural group selection dynamic in the Boyd and Richardson sense to explain why many Chinese people share the same lineage manipulation mechanisms, even if they're genetically unrelated.
I see.
So I see that. That's better. That's now I understand better. Yeah. I'm not sure. So on the one hand, you could say you need cultural evolutionary group selection elements to explain this, and on the other way of thinking about it, you don't. You need to draw, say, from mechanisms of transmission between groups, and that's the more modest way to do it. Right. So I mean, when you think about the lineages against which I would like to test this, after all, when sexual strategies theory was tested, it wasn't the first people that it was tested on were not homosexual, lesbian, or asexual. They were just common heterosexual people. Likewise, to test this theory, I'd like to give it a go against Chinese culture because it has pretty much the longest lived succession of lineages, some of which go back millennia. There are medieval Chinese documents with lineage, like birth records going back for 800 years for just one lineage. And that includes lots of branching lineage. So just by diffusion, this is one way to, 800, so if an average generation is 27 years, by 800, we're gonna have lots and lots of diffusion, and that's forms of inheritance causing people. So way back when my ancestors engaged in foot binding, and now I find that my descendants will also, So that's one thing. The second mechanism that also doesn't require group selection is interlineage competition. So if I realize, wow, man, that lineage has lots of war-hungry males, and where did their females go? And they're beating us on the battlefield, then I need to increase the number of males in my lineage. So that kind of interlineage competition is very similar. In fact, it's more, at this level, it's very similar to just intergroup competition. And we would expect to see horizontal transmission on those grounds, again, without necessarily invoking group selection. Yes?
So most of your focus when you're saying lineage is patrilineage. And I am just curious about whether is that just because of the sort of sexual strategies angle of this about paternity certainty, or like could this work through matrilineages? And if it did, would it work differently where you didn't have those same kinds of constraints? Because yes, the like skew of the curve in terms of fitness is different, right, for if you're going through the matrilineage, but on the other hand, you don't have the risks of paternity uncertainty. And so this all just seems very male-focused, and I'm wondering why.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I guess it is. So one reason is just that I came to this theory professionally, not through like straight up theoretical biology, but through the study of Chinese culture. There were things about the culture and its stretch over time I couldn't explain. And incidentally, Chinese culture is quite highly patrilineal, patriarchal. So that was really and most of my examples had to do with China for the reason of my background. In fact, in one of the slides I think I mentioned, I don't know a lot about other like anthropological sources to discover how matrilineal societies would do this. That's a concern to me, and I'd like to do that. Because of that focus, it was rather straightforward for me to look at, say, mate guarding and things like that would be more applicable to patrilineal traditions. But on top of that, there's the fact that, as I understand it, patrilineal traditions are just much greater in number than matrilineal traditions over the sweep of human history across cultures. So that meant that there might be some more studies, so if I read Chagnon or people like that, I might just happen to identify more facts about the patrilineal cultures. However, I would be very eager to get recommendations on readings I can do to meet this need and make sure that the theory is well prepared to work with potentially matrilineal traditions that may significantly differ from some of the ones that we mentioned.
I just think there may be more matrilineage generally tends to be viewed as less stable than patrilineage, and so when you've seen shifts that happen, they often flip from matrilineage to patrilineage, and less often vice versa. Although maybe some paper that changed this and that, so it could be that it's more deeply. It's like I wasn't thinking of it just in terms of like, oh, there are different kinds of matrilineal traditions that you could look at, but more about whether those dynamics actually are sort of underpinning some of the way that this might work at a deeper level, and if that could help to explain why, for example, matrilineage tends to be less stable when in some sort of ways you might think it should be more stable.
Certainly, yes, indeed. As you mentioned, the paternal uncertainty hypothesis suggests that there's going to be elements of matrilineal societies that are insulated against some of the constraints and obstacles, but there are also unique matrilineal traditions that are not, so far as I know, paralleled along the patrilineal cultures. So, I mentioned my kind of China bias is just kind of where what I've studied, but even within the Chinese world, there's the Moso people, and they have a famously interesting walking marriage. So this is a matrilineal culture in southwestern China, and the walking marriage is its own tradition, and it's not represented among patrilineal cultures, so far as I can tell. And this is one in which young women marry but remain residents at their matrilineal natal home. So this creates a lot of potential paternal uncertainty but that's absorbed within the cultural context. So that's one example in which traditions would probably differ. And furthermore, those traditions may be quite relevant to ancestors, matrilineal ancestors, patrilineal ancestors' fitness interests. Thanks for your observation.
Two questions. One is just trying to get contrast between the more cultural group story and this kind of story. And then one on the extent to which this is in competition with those kinds of stories. So on the first question, one place to look for some differences is these effects that go by way of population structure, like population size. Like just thinking about demography, like how big a population is, how much division of labor there is. And like on this kind of story, are you thinking there's ways of those kinds of effects on ability to survive catastrophe or get an influx of variation? Those are represented in this model, or they're kind of endogenous to the model depicted here, and you'd have to add them to give you different measures of how well a lineage is likely to do depending on those kinds of extrinsic circumstances. So you could take the very same lineage and then put it in a bigger population and have the lineage doing better or worse, as the case may be. And that's just a question to kind of explore the relevant kinds of contrasts. So it's just this general question about like how do you see population structure as mattering to the story you're giving here?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have a clear answer to the question. I hadn't really thought it through as to how lineage manipulation would channel like survivability of a catastrophe or something like that. I haven't.
The kinds of things that people, when they're talking about why certain kinds of cultural group settings can be more adaptive, it's just it's effectively one of the sorts of innovation being constant and just having more individuals. So it's a way of increasing. Likelihood of something being passed on. If you have multiple potential people to learn it from, well, you can absorb kind of an accident happening that one person who had the skill if the population's bigger, and so that's a way in which that's a kind of clearly cultural group level thing to manipulate. It's like how big is the cultural group? Like how much division of labor is there? And so one question is just like where is that going to happen on this kind of story, and so like what's missing in the visual might be like, okay, there's just this other thing you have to compare a lineage to is what's the rest of the population structure going to be like?
So I am familiar with the cultural evolutionary literature about toolkit size and population. That was regarded, there's a paper by Joseph Henrich about this having to do with Tasmania, and but it turns out that just, that seems wrong now. And there's a very, very testy back and forth between Joe and Mark Collard and his group. Vasen, I think, is a V-A-E-S. That's the first few letters of the response. And there's a response to the response and a response to the response. It goes on. Suffice it to say that this relationship between toolkit size and population size is very unclear to me now. So I'm not sure, but your thought stimulates, your question stimulates a further thought about the role of innovation in learning. So one of the background conditions of this theory's selection in a gene culture coevolutionary process is that LMMs are much more likely to be selected in ecologies that favor social learning, that make social learning adaptive. And insofar as individual learning is adaptive, people will be able to exit their natal home and not care what the ancestors said because food is abundant, predators are scarce, pathogens are low, I'm going to survive, I'm going to reproduce, I don't need you anymore. On the other hand, so in environments with strong traditions of social learning, the consequence could be that there's in LMMs, LMM-style cultures, it could be that learning is channeled so thoroughly that there's going to be a certain kind of obedience to tradition that would fall afoul of needs to innovate, to survive, one-off catastrophes. I can completely see that. I think there's probably I mean, this would be, we would need to turn to like an HRAF or SCCS or something or DPlace to work on that. But that's an interesting thought there. Please.
Yeah, so I think it's just a good question that I was thinking about, and I think it has to do with your question as well. I was thinking of like the behaviors that decrease, like ancestors' marginal fitness. Like one of them, if you think of some countries that have like have very low birth rates, like South Korea and Japan. Could that be kind of like a cultural something, that decreases the ancestors' marginal fitness, and then tied to that, or am I just seeing it wrong? And then tied to that, then that means that our ancestors didn't have any. They of course didn't plan that the lineage would go extinct by the culture. I'm just very curious what your thought on those issues.
The ancestors weren't happy when the one-child policy went into effect in China, right? And clearly, it's not so. I suppose one way of looking at it is that most places in the world, in most countries, it seems like ancestor fitness is decreasing because fitness is decreasing, that, or at least the rate of reproduction is decreasing. So, it's interesting because I don't know how this theory is built around older traditions, and it's like so many theories in evolutionary psychology. When you fast forward up to the present, we have to deal with this huge mismatch problem, and that's a big challenge. So I hadn't thought about the theory's application to like contemporary first world types of like civil societies. Instead, this theory is kind of conditional on certain background facts about the social ecology or the length of the lineage and so on. And now, I started off by asking you what you owe to your ancestors, and I added, well, if you know your ancestors. So now, I think far fewer people than ever before even know, can name their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. So there's a kind of we've lost this association with being part of a family lineage to some extent. It's especially true in the West, and in China. During the heart of the Communist Revolution and thereafter, like they made this. I showed you the painting of Qingming holiday, the grave sweeping day holiday, which is a lineage holiday, and it was banned for years, and it only came back recently. So these traditions, lineage-based traditions, they're fractionated in a context of mass individualism. And honestly, may I just put in so I conceive of this talk as really about the social consequences of religion, and I was very interested in some cross-cultural social psych suggesting that people in different parts of our planet are increasingly tuning back into kinship concepts and even ancestor worship kinds of concepts as a form of meaning making when their membership in groups is so anonymized and tethered by all these mediating features that they've lost that life-giving meaning. Sorry. Please.
When you were showing your addition to Hamilton's rule, you had M as the factor that's going to be essentially the way I'm thinking of it is something like perceived relatedness, perceived benefits, perceived costs, or something about the way that just a strict Hamiltonian approach where these things are somehow known is, being, shifted through some sort of inherited ideology, let's say. But do you conceive of that as being I guess I was thinking about how susceptible to manipulation you would expect individuals to be in those three different layers. Like how much wiggle room in human psychology do you think there is about how big the benefits are to possible other group members, relatives or not? How susceptible to manipulation do you think human psychology is in terms of the costs itself? Like how do you, and then also, or is it that most of the manipulation has to do with the relatedness coefficient, and just any kinds of case studies or data that would attest to how humans in different social situations are motivated by these manipulated, culturally translated kind of interpretations of these values.
It's a really, I really love your question. Thank you so much for giving it some voice. I don't know exactly how to answer it, but I would love to do some experiments on one of these hypotheses, like kinship estimation across genetic distance, across cultures. I think that's one way to speak to your point. You're right. The value of M, it's so this is kind of it's representing a manipulation factor, but and among things that can be manipulated is your kinship. You can, and so maybe some of you know this from personal experience. Like, so maybe you were told later in life, oh, you know what? You actually aren't our child. We've raised you, but you're not our biological child. And if you think through what goes through that person's mind, the costs, as you're pointing out, the costs are pretty huge, because if that person were to find out, then that can create a ton of alienation. Like, wow, do these people, my aunts and uncles, do they care for me in the same way? So that's an interesting cost to manipulation. There's sort of a feedback there, because if somebody is manipulated in this deceptive sense and they find out, that could provide a lot of not fitness enhancing behavior from your person. So, but in terms of data or information from anthropology, it's all circumstantial. It's all kind of case by case. But so in anthropological field sort of reports and such, like a Chagnon kind of thing, you have lots of representation of fictive kinship terminology. And some of it is like fictive, some of it, under a patrolateral cross-cousin marriage, it's not even exactly fictive if you're marrying your sister, So it's so the marital tradition combines with the linguistic tradition to provide a certain kind of manipulation, but the sum total of that, the beliefs about the relatedness of somebody you're marrying, are actually kind of in accord with that tradition. So sometimes it's not, but I'm sorry, that's a bit rambling. I think I sense the depth of your answer, and I agree with you about the fact that this manipulation factor. Some of the manipulation is about relatedness. You can be deceived about who you're genetically related to, and some of the manipulation might be to upsell benefits to certain kinds of downstream behaviors. Like, you should always say please, and you'll get what you want that way, right? So some manipulation may be minimizing costs. Probably shouldn't say more because it would be too speculative, but thank you.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our Q&A time, so thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you. Oh.